In the heart of Manhattan, a woman named Elisa Cortez lived a life she never imagined for herself. A single mother working as a housekeeper at the prestigious Grand Regency Hotel, she was no stranger to the daily grind of dusting, vacuuming, and polishing the lives of others. But Elisa had dreams beyond the white linens and polished brass of the hotel's luxurious suites. She dreamed of giving her young son, Max, a future brighter than her own. Max, her curious and spirited 9-year-old, often teased her about her day job, but Elisa knew her son saw her as his world. She was his rock, and even though life was tough, Elisa took pride in her work. She saw herself as more than just a maid. She was a mother with an unbreakable resolve. The Grand Regency was where the city's elite came to escape, indulge, and be seen. Each guest room was a canvas of luxury, and Elisa knew every inch of it by heart. But one afternoon, while cleaning a penthouse suite that belonged to a high-profile fashion mogul, her life took a turn she couldn't foresee. While inspecting the suite, she found herself staring at a rack of designer clothes left out by the fashion mogul's assistant. With the penthouse empty and her day nearly over, Elisa couldn't resist the temptation. She tried on a stunning cream-colored dress, slipping into a world far removed from her daily life. As she gazed at her reflection, Elisa almost didn't recognize the woman in the mirror. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel like the woman she dreamed of becoming. But her reverie was abruptly interrupted by a knock at the door. Startled, Elisa quickly changed back and resumed her duties, but the thrill lingered. Little did she know, this impulsive act would soon set off a chain of events that would transform her life. The following day, Elisa's routine was interrupted by a guest who had taken up residence in the hotel's penthouse. His name was Jonathan Mercer, a charismatic and influential businessman who had recently made headlines for his ambitious philanthropic projects. Known for his laid-back charm and good looks, Jonathan had a reputation that preceded him, but Elisa only knew him as the guy in the suite on 29. Elisa barely had time to process her morning before she was called up to the penthouse to assist with a special request. Heart-pounding, she knocked and entered the suite, only to be met by Jonathan himself, casually dressed in jeans and a shirt, radiating an effortless charm that immediately threw her off guard. "Hello, are you the one saving me from my own chaos?" he asked, with a warm smile. Elisa managed a polite nod and a smile, trying to focus on her duties. Jonathan had misplaced some important papers, and she was asked to help locate them among the tangle of his belongings. As they worked together, Elisa couldn't help but notice how different he was from the type of guests she usually served. He treated her with respect, even casually asking her opinion about the city and his favorite places to explore. Despite her efforts to stay professional, Elisa found herself enjoying their brief conversation. Jonathan had an easy way about him, and for once, she felt seen, not as the housekeeper cleaning his room, but as a person with her own thoughts and dreams. As they spoke, Jonathan asked her about her life outside of work. Caught off guard, Elisa kept her answer vague, feeling self-conscious about sharing too much. She mentioned her son, Max, and Jonathan's face lit up. "My little sister's my world too," he shared. "I know what it's like to feel responsible for someone else." They exchanged a glance, a moment of shared understanding that left Elisa with a flutter of something she hadn't felt in years. After they finally located his missing papers, Jonathan thanked her, even offering her a light-hearted promise to remember her in his next speech about everyday heroes. Elisa laughed it off, but a part of her couldn't help but wonder if she'd actually made an impression. Later that evening, back in her modest apartment, Elisa replayed their conversation in her mind. The connection, however brief, had felt real, and it stirred something in her. Maybe she wasn't invisible after all. The following day, Elisa arrived at work feeling unusually energized. She couldn't quite shake the memory of her encounter with Jonathan, and she tried to convince herself it was silly to dwell on it. After all, he was a guest, someone from a completely different world. As she moved through her tasks, however, Elisa noticed a slight buzz among the hotel staff. Whispers circulated that Jonathan Mercer would be attending an exclusive charity gala that evening, hosted right at the Grand Regency's lavish ballroom. Elisa couldn't resist a pang of curiosity. She had heard about these events, the extravagance and glamour, the way they seemed to belong to another universe. Toward the end of her shift, Elisa was tidying up a guest room when she received a call from the front desk asking her to come downstairs. She assumed it was something routine, perhaps a guest request or a small task to handle before she clocked out. When she reached the lobby, however, she found Jonathan standing there, hands in his pockets and a slightly mischievous smile on his face. "Elisa, right?" he asked, his eyes bright with recognition. Before she could answer, he continued, "I was hoping you'd be willing to join me at the gala tonight. I know it's last minute, but I think you'd really enjoy it." Elisa felt her cheeks warm in shock and confusion. She glanced around, half expecting him to be speaking to someone else. "Me? At the gala?" Jonathan chuckled. "Why not? You deserve a night off, don't you?" Every rational part of Elisa's mind screamed at her to decline. This wasn't her world. She wasn't someone who attended high society galas or rubbed shoulders with Manhattan's elite. And yet, the idea was undeniably tempting. She hesitated, torn between reason and a pull she couldn't quite explain. After a long pause, she finally found her voice. "I'd love to go," she said, the words surprising even herself. Jonathan's smile widened. "Great. Meet me here at 7. And don't worry about a thing. The hotel's got a stylist who can help you get ready. Just tell them I sent you." Elisa left the lobby in a daze, wondering if this was some elaborate dream she'd soon wake up from. But as the hours passed and she found herself in the capable hands of the hotel stylist, reality started to sink in. For the first time, she allowed herself to feel the excitement of stepping into a world she'd only ever seen from the sidelines. At 7 sharp, Elisa descended the grand staircase in an elegant navy gown, her hair swept into a sophisticated updo. She felt like an entirely new person, yet she was still herself, just a version of herself she'd never had the chance to meet. When she reached the bottom of the stairs, she found Jonathan waiting, his gaze warm and admiring. He offered his arm, and as they entered the ballroom together, Elisa felt a strange mix of nerves and exhilaration. Tonight, for a few brief hours, she was no longer Elisa the housekeeper. She was a woman stepping into a world she'd never thought was meant for her. The Grand Regency ballroom glittered under crystal chandeliers, filled with laughter, music, and the clinking of champagne glasses. Elisa felt like she was floating, the elegance of the evening enchanting her in a way she'd never anticipated. As she moved through the crowd beside Jonathan, she caught glimpses of people she'd only read about in magazines: actors, TOs, politicians. It was surreal, and she had to resist the urge to pinch herself. Jonathan was the perfect escort, introducing her to guests and making her feel at ease. His warmth and humor calmed her nerves, and she found herself laughing and conversing more naturally than she would have ever thought possible. To everyone else, she was just another beautiful woman in a stunning gown. No one knew she was actually Elisa Cortez, the maid who cleaned their rooms during the day. Throughout the night, Elisa felt the weight of her usual identity slipping away. She was caught up in the moment, her senses heightened by the glamour around her. When Jonathan led her onto the dance floor, she hesitated, glancing at the elegantly dressed couples who moved gracefully to the soft jazz music. "I'm not exactly the best dancer," she admitted, feeling a touch of embarrassment. Jonathan smiled, unfazed. "Just follow my lead." As they danced, Elisa felt herself relax, letting him guide her through each step. She realized she trusted him, despite the whirlwind of their connection. She felt safe, like she could let down her guard and simply enjoy this experience. For a moment, they shared a silence that seemed to speak volumes. She saw a softness in Jonathan's eyes that hinted at something deeper than his polished exterior. It was as if he, too, was letting down his own guard, revealing a part of himself he rarely showed. Just as Elisa was beginning to feel truly at ease, a woman approached them, tall, striking, with an unmistakable air of confidence. She looked at Elisa with a mix of curiosity and subtle judgment before turning to Jonathan. "Jonathan, darling, you didn't introduce us," she said, her voice smooth but with a hint of possessiveness. Elisa suddenly felt the urge to shrink into the shadows, reminded of the vast gulf between her and these people. Jonathan, however, remained unfazed. "Elisa, this is Miranda, a friend of the family," he said, his tone hinting at a strained history. Miranda's gaze lingered on Elisa for a moment, a flicker of something resembling disdain crossing her expression. Elisa felt her pulse quicken, suddenly very aware of her place. But she steadied herself, giving Miranda a polite smile. She refused to let anyone ruin this night. The moment passed, but Miranda's presence lingered like a shadow over the rest of the evening. Elisa couldn't shake the feeling that she was an outsider, intruding on a world that wasn't hers. She tried to push the thought aside, focusing on Jonathan's kindness and the magic of the evening. As the night came to an end, Jonathan escorted her back to the hotel lobby. They stood in the quiet glow of the chandelier, the world around them fading into the background. "Thank you, Jonathan," Elisa said softly. "This was more than I ever expected." He looked at her, his expression sincere. "You deserved it. And more." For a moment, Elisa thought he might lean in to kiss her, but instead he gently held her hand, lingering just long enough for her heart to skip a beat. As she returned to her modest apartment that night, her mind was spinning. Jonathan had opened a door to a world she never thought she'd be a part of, and a part of her couldn't help but want more. Days passed, but the memory of the gala and her time with Jonathan lingered in Elisa's mind like a spark she couldn't extinguish. She returned to her routine, the contrast between her life at the Grand Regency and the glamorous evening she'd experienced more striking than ever. She tried to convince herself it was just a fleeting dream, a night that had been an exception to her reality, but deep down, something had changed. Jonathan, too, seemed unable to let that night go. He began finding excuses to cross paths with her at the hotel, whether it was for a simple hello or a brief conversation in the hallways. Each encounter left Elisa feeling a thrill that she tried desperately to ignore, knowing that people like him didn't belong with people like her. And yet, every time she saw him, that rational voice grew fainter. One afternoon, while she was taking a break in the staff lounge, she was surprised to see Jonathan standing at the door, looking around as if he were on unfamiliar territory. When he spotted her, he broke into a smile. "Elisa, do you have a few minutes?" She glanced around, catching the curious looks from her coworkers. Feeling a mix of excitement and apprehension, she followed him into a quiet corner of the lobby. "What's going on?" she asked, trying to sound casual. Jonathan hesitated, as if weighing his words carefully. "I was thinking of going for a walk through Central Park this afternoon. Would you care to join me?" Elisa's heart raced. She knew it was probably unwise, that her position at the hotel could be jeopardized if anyone misinterpreted their relationship. But the offer was too tempting to resist. She nodded, barely trusting her own voice to answer. They strolled through the park in comfortable silence at first, taking in the sights and sounds of the city that stretched around them. For Elisa, Central Park had always been a place of refuge, somewhere she could take Max on weekends to escape the pressures of daily life. But today, walking beside Jonathan, it felt new, as if she were seeing it for the first time. Eventually, they found a bench overlooking a lake, and Jonathan turned to her, his expression serious yet warm. "I know we come from different worlds, Elisa," he said as if reading her thoughts. "But I don't think that should matter." Elisa looked down, the weight of his words settling over her. "You don't understand. This world you're in, it's not something I can just step into. I have responsibilities, a son to care for. I'm not someone who can just live in a fairy tale." Jonathan reached for her hand, holding it gently but firmly. "I'm not asking you to give up anything. All I'm asking is that you let me in, even just a little." For a moment, Elisa allowed herself to imagine what that might look like. A life where she didn't have to hide who she was, where she could be with someone who saw her for more than her job or her struggles. But reality loomed like a shadow, reminding her that this connection, however genuine it felt, was fragile. Despite her inner conflict, she couldn't bring herself to pull away. She held his gaze, feeling a connection that defied the barriers between them. And as they sat there, watching the afternoon sun cast a warm glow over the lake, she began to wonder if perhaps, just maybe, she could let herself believe in a new possibility. The days following their walk in Central Park were a whirlwind of emotions for Elisa. She found herself looking forward to the possibility of seeing Jonathan, her heart skipping a beat every time he appeared in the hotel's lobby or casually greeted her in the hallways. Yet, as much as she was drawn to him, the weight of her responsibilities and the reality of their differences lingered in the back of her mind. One evening, Elisa had just finished her shift and was preparing to leave when she was approached by Carmen, her closest friend and fellow housekeeper. Carmen had a knack for sensing when something was going on, and tonight was no different. "Elisa," she said, leaning in conspiratorially, "I've noticed you've been smiling a lot more lately. Don't tell me you've fallen for one of these fancy hotel guests." Elisa blushed, unable to hide her emotions, but she quickly tried to brush it off. "Carmen, it's nothing like that. He's just someone I've talked to a few times." Carmen's eyes sparkled with mischief. "Just be careful, my friend. Men from that world don't understand our lives. They think everything is a game." Elisa nodded, appreciating the concern but feeling a pang of defensiveness. She knew Jonathan was different, or at least she wanted to believe he was. But Carmen's words lingered in her mind as she left the hotel, wondering if perhaps she was letting herself get swept up in a fantasy. The following day, Elisa was working in one of the suites when she heard familiar voices approaching in the hallway. She froze, realizing it was Jonathan and Miranda, the same woman who had approached them at the gala. Elisa quickly moved to the other side of the room, not wanting to overhear their conversation but unable to avoid it entirely. "Jonathan, you're throwing away everything you've worked for, all for some maid?" Miranda's voice dripped with disdain, her words cutting through the air like a knife. Elisa's heart pounded, a wave of humiliation washing over her. She hadn't known Miranda was aware of her, much less her connection with Jonathan. She felt exposed, as if her private world had been laid bare for judgment. Jonathan's voice was firm but restrained. "Miranda, this isn't your business. Elisa's not just some maid. She's a person with her own dreams and dignity. And I won't let anyone talk about her like that." Elisa's chest tightened, torn between a sense of pride at his defense and a lingering feeling of unworthiness. As she stood there, hidden in the shadows, she realized the depth of her feelings for Jonathan and the challenges that came with them. When they finally left, Elisa remained alone in the quiet suite, grappling with the realization that her heart was no longer her own. She knew this connection was fraught with complications and risks, but the bond between them was undeniable. However, she also knew she couldn't simply ignore her responsibilities or the boundaries between their worlds. Later that evening, Elisa found herself at home, watching Max as he worked on his homework. His presence grounded her, reminding her of her purpose and the reason she worked so hard. She couldn't afford to lose herself in a fairy tale, especially one that might ultimately hurt them both. And yet, as she drifted off to sleep that night, Elisa couldn't help but hold onto a fragile hope that perhaps love could be stronger than the barriers between them. The next few days were a test of Elisa's strength and resolve. She tried to keep her distance from Jonathan, hoping to protect herself from the heartbreak she feared was inevitable. But fate seemed determined to bring them together. Every time she saw him at the hotel, her heart wavered, and despite her best efforts, her feelings grew stronger. One afternoon, Jonathan found her in the hotel's private garden, where she often took a few moments to catch her breath. He approached her quietly, a gentle but determined look in his eyes. "Elisa," he said softly, "I feel like you're slipping away. Tell me what's going on." She took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. "Jonathan, I'm not sure if this is right. You come from a world I'll never be a part of, and as much as I care about you, I have to be realistic. I have responsibilities, a son who depends on me. I can't afford to get lost in something that might not work." Jonathan stepped closer, his eyes filled with sincerity. "I know it's complicated, Elisa. I know there are challenges. But don't you think we owe it to ourselves to try? I've never met anyone like you, and I don't want to lose you, just because our lives don't fit perfectly together." She looked away, her mind racing. Part of her longed to give in, to let herself believe in the possibility of happiness with him. But she couldn't ignore the reality of their circumstances. How could she risk her heart, and Max's stability, for a love that might be fleeting? As they stood in silence, Miranda appeared on the path, her gaze shifting between them with a look of cold disdain. She approached, her posture confident, as if she'd already won some unspoken battle. "So, this is where you've been hiding, Jonathan," Miranda said, her tone dripping with contempt. She looked at Elisa with a slight smirk. "I guess some people are content with scraps, aren't they?" Jonathan's face hardened. "Enough, Miranda. I'm done with your games." Miranda gave a laugh, bitter and hollow. "You think she'll stay with you, Jonathan? She'll use you until she gets what she wants, just like everyone else. Don't be so naive." Elisa felt her stomach twist, Miranda's words stinging more deeply than she wanted to admit. She knew Miranda's assumptions were wrong, but the accusation fed her insecurities. She couldn't bear the thought of being viewed as a charity case or a passing fascination. "I think it's best if I go," Elisa whispered, pulling herself away from Jonathan's grasp. Jonathan reached out, his face etched with desperation. "Elisa, please, don't let her words get in the way of us." But Elisa had already made up her mind. She turned and walked away, her heart shattering with each step. She knew she had to protect herself, to prioritize the life she'd built and the son who depended on her. As much as she cared for Jonathan, this was a risk she couldn't take. That evening, Elisa lay awake, the pain of her decision lingering like a weight on her chest. She reminded herself of her responsibilities, the sacrifices she'd made to get this far. Love was a luxury she couldn't afford, and it was time she accepted that. But deep down, a part of her couldn't help but wonder if she'd just walked away from the only chance at true happiness she'd ever known. Days passed, and Elisa threw herself into her work, determined to bury her feelings for Jonathan. She avoided the places they'd shared, steering clear of the private garden and staying out of the lobby as much as possible. But despite her best efforts, she couldn't escape the emptiness that lingered. One afternoon, while helping Max with his homework, she noticed his somber expression. He looked up at her, his young face wise beyond his years. "Mom, are you okay?" Elisa forced a smile, brushing a hand over his hair. "I'm fine, Max. Just tired." But Max wasn't convinced. "You always tell me to go after what I want. Why don't you?" His words struck her, resonating in a way she hadn't anticipated. She realized that in trying to protect herself, she might be setting an example of fear rather than courage. She had spent years telling Max to chase his dreams, yet here she was, hiding from her own. That night, as she lay awake, Elisa made a decision. She couldn't continue living in fear of the unknown. If there was even a chance for happiness with Jonathan, she had to find the strength to face it. The next morning, she dressed in her best outfit, determined to seek him out. She arrived at the Grand Regency, her heart pounding, and approached the front desk. "I'm here to see Jonathan Mercer," she said, her voice steady. The receptionist nodded and directed her to the rooftop terrace, where Jonathan often went to escape the chaos of his schedule. Elisa took a deep breath as she made her way up, each step filled with anticipation. When she reached the terrace, she found him standing by the railing, looking out over the city. He turned at the sound of her footsteps, his face lighting up in surprise and relief. "Elisa," he said softly, his voice filled with unspoken questions. She stepped closer, her gaze steady. "I tried to walk away because I was afraid. Afraid of what people would think, afraid of the challenges, afraid of failing. But I realized that if I don't take this chance, I'll always wonder what might have been." Jonathan's expression softened, and he closed the distance between them. "I don't care about the differences between us, Elisa. I care about you." As he reached out, Elisa took his hand, allowing herself to feel the weight of the moment, the possibility of a life she'd only dreamed of. She knew there would be obstacles, that their journey wouldn't be easy. But for the first time, she felt ready to face whatever came their way. They stood together, the city stretching out beneath them, a world of unknowns waiting to unfold. And as Elisa looked into Jonathan's eyes, she felt a sense of peace and certainty she hadn't known before. She had chosen love, not because it was easy, but because it was worth fighting for. In that moment, Elisa knew she had found something rare and precious, a love that saw beyond titles and backgrounds, that valued her for who she truly was. And with Jonathan by her side, she felt ready to embrace whatever the future held, one step at a time. As Elisa and Jonathan began navigating their relationship in the open, they quickly discovered that love, while powerful, was only part of the equation. Manhattan's elite society, where Jonathan's name carried weight and influence, wasn't as accepting as Elisa had hoped. Rumors swirled, and whispers followed them in the hotel and beyond, as people speculated about their relationship and questioned Elisa's intentions. One evening, they attended a charity event together, marking their first public appearance as a couple. Elisa dressed elegantly, and Jonathan stayed by her side, reassuring her with a gentle squeeze of her hand whenever she seemed nervous. But throughout the night, she could feel the eyes on her, the subtle glances and raised eyebrows. The whispers were more pointed now, sometimes accompanied by dismissive smiles or the occasional probing question. At one point, they were approached by a well-known socialite named Victoria Langston, a woman with influence and a reputation for ruthless gossip. Victoria offered them a thin smile, her gaze flicking over Elisa with barely concealed judgment. "So, Jonathan," she said with a gleam in her eye, "I see you found yourself a refreshing companion." Jonathan's expression remained calm, but Elisa could feel his tension. "Elisa's more than a companion," he replied coolly. "She's my partner." Victoria raised a single eyebrow, her smile tightening. "How charming. I only hope she's prepared for the demands of our world." As Victoria walked away, Elisa felt the familiar pang of self-doubt. She had expected challenges, but facing them head-on was more difficult than she'd imagined. She worried about the impact on Jonathan's reputation, about whether she could truly belong in his world without compromising her sense of self. Later that night, as they returned to Jonathan's apartment, Elisa voiced her concerns. "I don't want to be the reason people don't take you seriously, Jonathan. I don't want you to lose respect or credibility because of me." Jonathan took her hands, his gaze unwavering. "I didn't fall in love with you to please everyone else, Elisa. I fell in love with you because you're real, because you make me feel alive. The rest of the world will just have to catch up." But as much as Jonathan's words comforted her, Elisa couldn't ignore the growing pressure. She wanted to be with him, but she also wanted to be accepted, not for what she could gain from his status, but for who she was. Over the coming weeks, Elisa faced this reality with determination. She continued to work at the Grand Regency, refusing to rely solely on Jonathan's wealth or influence. She wanted to prove, both to herself and to the world, that her worth wasn't defined by her relationship. And as their bond deepened, she found a new strength within herself, a resilience that reminded her of why she'd fought so hard to build a life on her own terms. In the end, she knew that love would only be as strong as their commitment to face the world together. And as they moved forward, Elisa and Jonathan both realized that while the journey would be difficult, they were willing to take every step, side by side.